Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will absolutely humble your worst winter camping experience. We're diving deep into how the Vikings, those legendary seafaring warriors, managed to survive the brutal, bone-chilling nights of Scandinavian winter. Not just survive, mind you, but thrive in conditions that would send most of us running for the nearest heated hotel lobby. So before you get comfortable under your electric blanket, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Inly enjoy what I do here. But only if you genuine, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're in 9th century Norway. The sun hasn't shown its face for weeks, and when it does peek over the horizon, it's barely a pale ghost of itself, casting long shadows across endless fields of snow. The temperature has plummeted to levels that would make a polar bear reconsider its life choices. Howling winds rip across the landscape like the breath of angry gods, carrying with them the promise of death for anyone foolish enough to venture outside unprepared. This isn't just winter. This is nature at its most merciless, a season that separates the survivors from the frozen. Yet somehow, entire communities of Vikings not only endured these conditions, but built thriving societies in the heart of this frozen wasteland. They raised families, crafted intricate art, composed epic sagas, and yes, even threw legendary parties that would make modern celebrations look like quiet book clubs. How did they do it? What ancient secrets did these northern warriors possess that allowed them to laugh in the face of winter's wrath? Tonight, cover every detail of Viking. We're going to Yuan winter survival, from the ingenious architecture of their longhouses to the complex social systems that kept communities sane during months of enforced confinement. We'll explore how they turned the very elements that threatened to kill them into allies, how they transformed the darkest season into a time of cultural richness and spiritual renewal. And perhaps most remarkably, we'll discover how they maintained not just physical warmth, but the warmth of human connection in conditions that would drive most people to the brink of madness. The story begins with understanding that surviving a Viking winter wasn't just about having enough firewood and warm clothes. It was about creating an entire ecosystem of survival, a delicate balance of preparation, community cooperation, and sheer, bloody-minded determination. Every aspect of Viking life, from their religious beliefs to their architectural innovations, was shaped by the relentless reality of winter. Let's start with the foundation of their survival, literally. The Viking longhouse wasn't just a building, it was a fortress against the elements, a carefully engineered marvel that represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about fighting the cold. Imagine a structure that looks like it was designed by someone who understood that winter was actively trying to kill you and responded by building the architectural equivalent of a middle finger to the weather gods. These weren't the cozy log cabins you might picture from Hollywood movies. Viking longhouses were massive communal structures, often stretching over 100 feet in length, designed to house extended families, their livestock, their stored food, and occasionally their guests, all under one roof. The construction was nothing short of brilliant. Thick timber walls provided the skeleton, but the real genius lay in the insulation. Layer upon layer of sod, sometimes several feet thick, covered the roof like a green blanket. This wasn't just decoration. Sod is one of nature's most effective insulators, trapping air in countless tiny pockets, while the living grass roots held everything together. The walls themselves were marvels of medieval engineering. Vikings used a technique called wattle and daub, weaving branches between wooden posts and then plastering the gaps with a mixture of mud, clay, and whatever organic matter was available. Sometimes this included animal dung, which might sound primitive until you realize that dried manure is actually an excellent insulator and building material. Modern eco-builders are just now rediscovering techniques the Vikings mastered over 1,000 years ago. But here's where it gets really clever. The floor of a Viking longhouse was often excavated slightly below ground level. This wasn't laziness or poor planning. It was sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics. The earth itself provided natural insulation, protecting the inhabitants from the worst of the ground frost, while creating a natural windbreak. The entrance was frequently built as a kind of airlock, a tunnel or vestibule that prevented icy air from rushing directly into the living space every time someone opened the door. Windows, when they existed at all, were tiny and covered with thin sheets of animal membrane, usually from a cow's bladder or carefully scraped horn. These materials allowed some light to filter through while maintaining the precious warmth inside. Glass windows were a luxury that wouldn't become common in Northern Europe for centuries to come, and frankly, the Viking solution worked better anyway. Their organic window coverings provided better insulation than the single-pane glass that would eventually replace them. The heart of every longhouse was the central hearth, and calling it the heart isn't just poetic metaphor. This was literally where life and death were decided. The fire that burned in this stone-lined pit wasn't just for warmth. It was the community's lifeline, their cooking surface, their light source, their gathering place, and their connection to the divine. Vikings understood that fire wasn't just about combustion, it was about survival itself. The hearth was positioned with mathematical precision. Too close to the walls, and you'd burn down your home. Too far from the sleeping areas, and people would freeze in their beds. The Vikings found the perfect balance, creating a zone of warmth that extended throughout the living space without creating dangerous hotspots. The smoke hole in the roof above the hearth was carefully sized and positioned to create proper draft, drawing the smoke up and out while minimizing heat loss. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. The central fire burned continuously throughout the winter months. Not just during the day, not just when people were awake, but 24 hours a day for months on end. This required an understanding of fire management that went far beyond simply throwing logs on a flame. Vikings became masters of wood selection, knowing exactly which types of wood burned hottest, which lasted longest, which produced the least smoke, and which could be banked to smolder safely through the night. Banking a fire is an art form that most modern people have never learned. It involves carefully arranging coals and ash to create a controlled burn that produces steady heat without active flames. Done correctly, a banked fire could maintain warmth through an entire night and be easily rekindled in the morning. Done incorrectly, you'd wake up to a cold house and face the dangerous task of starting a new fire from scratch in sub-zero temperatures. The fuel requirements were staggering. A single longhouse could consume several tons of wood during a harsh winter, and that's assuming careful management and efficient burning. This meant that fuel gathering wasn't just a seasonal activity. It was a year-round obsession that shaped every aspect of Viking society. Entire communities would organize massive wood-gathering expeditions during the warmer months, cutting and stockpiling enough timber to last through the dark season. They understood different woods with the precision of modern chemists. Oak burned hot and long, but was difficult to ignite. Pine caught fire easily, but burned quickly and produced resin that could clog the smoke hole. Birch provided steady heat and was relatively clean burning, making it perfect for banking overnight fires. Apple and other fruit woods burned beautifully, but were too valuable as food sources to waste as fuel, except on special occasions. The Vikings also pioneered the use of peat as a fuel source in areas where wood was scarce. Peat, formed from partially decomposed organic matter in bogs, burns with a distinctive earthy smell and provides steady, long-lasting heat. Cutting and drying peat became a specialized skill, with entire families dedicating weeks to harvesting this crucial fuel source during the brief summer months. Around the central hearth, the longhouse was organized with the precision of a military operation. Raised platforms along the walls served multiple functions. During the day, they were workbenches, dining areas, and social spaces. At night, they transformed into beds for the human inhabitants. The positioning wasn't random. The most important family members, the elderly and small children, got the spots closest to the fire. Everyone else arranged themselves in a careful hierarchy based on age, status, and their ability to contribute to the community's survival. But humans weren't the only occupants of the longhouse during winter. In a stroke of genius that modern homesteaders are only beginning to appreciate, Vikings often shared their winter quarters with their livestock. Cows, sheep, goats, and horses weren't just allowed inside. They were welcomed as furry, four-legged heating systems. A single cow produces about the same amount of heat as a small space heater, and unlike a space heater, cows also provide milk, eventually meat, and if you're really desperate, fuel for your fire in the form of dried dung. This wasn't just about warmth, though the body heat of large animals was certainly welcome during the coldest nights. It was about protection. Livestock represented wealth, food security, and survival resources that couldn't be left outside to freeze or be stolen by hungry neighbors or wild predators. Bears, wolves, and human raiders all posed constant threats to valuable animals, making the longhouse a fortress not just against the weather, but against anyone or anything that might threaten the community's survival. The smell, as you might imagine, was absolutely incredible. And by incredible, I mean it would probably knock a modern person unconscious within minutes. Imagine the combined aromas of wood smoke, unwashed humans who hadn't bathed in months, wet wool clothing, animal waste, fermenting food, and the general mustiness that comes from living in an enclosed space with minimal ventilation. Vikings didn't just tolerate this olfactory assault, they lived in it, worked in it, slept in it, and somehow managed to maintain their sanity and social bonds despite conditions that would challenge even the most patient modern family. The social dynamics of longhouse living required careful management and unwritten but strictly enforced rules about behavior, space, and responsibilities. Privacy as we understand it simply didn't exist. Every conversation could be heard by dozens of people. Every argument became community business. Every snore, every cough, every midnight trip to relieve yourself was shared with your extended family, their friends, and whatever livestock happened to be bunking nearby. Yet somehow, this system worked. Vikings developed sophisticated social protocols for managing close quarters living that anthropologists are still studying today. They created designated spaces for different activities, established quiet hours for sleep, and developed conflict resolution systems that prevented minor disagreements from escalating into violence that could destroy the entire community. The daily routine inside a longhouse during of the community. People W, the limited daylight and the needs winter followed rhythms dictated by the fired attention. Someone had to add fuel to, but because the fire need a yoki before dawn, not because they want, stir the coals, and ensure that the precious flame that kept everyone job for just anyone alive continued burning. This wasn't often given to the most experienced Anne. Fire tending was a skilled responsibility trusted members of the household. As the pale winter sun finally appeared, dat all, the if it appear, longhouse would come alive with activity. But this wasn't the bustling activity of spring or summer. Winter work was different. It was careful, deliberate, focused on maintenance rather than production. Tools needed sharpening and repair. Clothing required mending and waterproofing. Weapons had to be cleaned and maintained. Food stores needed monitoring and rotation to prevent spoilage. The women of the household, when they weren't managing the countless other responsibilities of keeping everyone alive, spent much of their time on textile work. This wasn't hobby crafting. This was industrial production essential for survival. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every sail for the ships had to be made by hand using techniques that required years to master. Spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into fabric, cutting and sewing fabric into garments. All of this happened during the long winter nights by the light of the central fire. The process of creating winter clothing was an intricate dance between necessity and artistry that began months before the first frost appeared. Viking women understood wool like modern engineers understand steel, knowing exactly how different sheep breeds produce fibers with varying properties. The coarse outer wool of hardy northern sheep provided water resistance and durability, while the softer undercoat offered insulation and comfort against the skin. They could judge the quality of fleece by touch, determining which portions would become outer garments and which would be reserved for underclothes or baby items. Spinning wasn't just about creating thread, it was about engineering survival. The twist and tension applied during spinning determined how the finished fabric would behave in wet conditions, how it would hold up to constant wear, and how effectively it would trap warm air. Viking women could spin wool so fine it felt like silk, or so thick and tightly twisted it would shed water like duck feathers. They understood that loose spun wool created better insulation by trapping more air, while tightly spun thread produced fabric that could withstand the brutal conditions of sea voyages and winter storms. The weaving process itself was a community affair. Large looms dominated sections of the longhouse, and the rhythmic clacking of the heddle bars provided a constant soundtrack to winter life. Women would work together, sharing techniques, gossiping, and passing down knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. The patterns they created weren't just decorative. Different weaves served specific functions, with tighter weaves for outer garments and looser, more flexible weaves for underclothing and baby wraps. Color came from the landscape around them, extracted through processes that bordered on alchemy. Madder root produced deep reds, woad created brilliant blues, and various lichens yielded purples and yellows that could transform rough wool into garments fit for royalty. The dyeing process required precise timing and temperature control, often done in large vats heated by the central fire. The colors weren't just aesthetic choices. Darker colors absorbed more heat from the weak winter sun, while certain dyes actually improved the wool's water-resistant properties. But clothing was just the beginning of textile production. Vikings needed rope for everything from securing thatch roofs to rigging their ships. They needed nets for fishing, bags for storage, and countless other fabric items that modern people take for granted. Every scrap of fiber was precious, and nothing was wasted. Old clothing was unraveled and respun, worn-out sails were cut down into smaller items, and even the scraps left over from cutting new garments were saved for patching and repairs. The men weren't idle during these long winter nights either. While the women worked with textiles, the men focused on woodworking and metal craft. The constant heat from the central fire created ideal conditions for certain types of craftsmanship. Wood could be steamed and bent into complex shapes for ship construction, and metal could be worked at temperatures that would be impossible to achieve outdoors during winter. Weapon maintenance was a constant concern. Iron tools and weapons were vulnerable to rust in the humid conditions inside the longhouse, where breath from dozens of humans and animals created constant moisture in the air. Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for preventing corrosion, using animal fats and plant-based oils to create protective coatings that would last through the winter months. They understood that a rusty sword or a corroded axe head could mean the difference between life and death when spring arrived and conflicts resumed. The creation of new weapons during winter became almost ritualistic. Master smiths would work by the light of the central fire, heating metal in small forges built into the hearth itself. The process of forging a sword could take weeks, with each step requiring precise timing and temperature control. The rhythmic hammering became another soundtrack of winter life, competing with the clacking of looms and the crackling of burning wood. These weren't just functional tools. Viking craftsmen understood that weapons were extensions of their owners' identities, and they lavished incredible attention on decorative details that served both aesthetic and practical purposes. Intricate patterns weren't just beautiful, they also improved grip, reduced weight, and sometimes incorporated designs believed to provide magical protection in battle. The long winter nights also provided time for maintaining and improving their most valuable possessions, their ships. Even though the vessels were hauled ashore and covered for winter storage, they required constant attention. The harsh northern climate could split planks, loosen joints, and damage the intricate ropework that held everything together. Vikings would spend countless hours replacing worn timbers, recaulking seams, and maintaining the complex rigging systems that allowed their ships to sail in conditions that would destroy lesser vessels. Ship maintenance was community work that brought together craftsmen with different specialties. Carpenters worked alongside rope makers, while sail menders collaborated with metalworkers to ensure every component was ready for the sailing season. The knowledge required was staggering, covering everything from selecting the right types of wood for different parts of the hull to understanding how different rope materials behaved in various weather conditions. The social aspects of winter work were just as important as the practical results. These long nights of shared labor created bonds that held communities together through the most challenging times. Stories were told, songs were sung, and knowledge was passed from generation to generation in ways that no written text could match. Young people learned not just the technical skills they would need to survive, but also the cultural values and social expectations that defined Viking society. Food preparation during winter was an ongoing process that required constant attention and sophisticated planning. The preservation techniques Vikings had developed weren't just about making food last through the winter. They were about maintaining nutrition and preventing the diseases that could devastate a community confined in close quarters for months at a time. Smoking meat was both art and science, requiring precise control of temperature and humidity to achieve the perfect balance between preservation and flavor. Different woods imparted different tastes and had varying antimicrobial properties. Oak produced a mild flavor and excellent preservation, while juniper added distinctive taste and helped prevent spoilage. Applewood was prized for its sweet smoke, but only used for special occasions since fruit trees were too valuable to cut down casually. The smoking process itself could take days or even weeks, depending on the size and type of meat being preserved. Vikings built sophisticated smokehouses with adjustable vents that allowed precise control of airflow and temperature. The meat had to be turned regularly, monitored for signs of spoilage, and moved between different zones within the smokehouse as the curing process progressed. Salt, when it was available, transformed the preservation game entirely. Vikings who had access to coastal areas could evaporate seawater to produce salt, while inland communities had to trade for this precious commodity. Salt pork and salt fish could last for months without spoiling, providing crucial protein during the darkest parts of winter when fresh food was impossible to obtain. But preservation wasn't just about meat. Vikings developed incredibly sophisticated techniques for storing vegetables, grains, and dairy products through the winter months. Root vegetables were buried in sand-filled pits that prevented freezing while allowing air circulation. Cabbages were fermented into something resembling modern sauerkraut, creating a source of vitamin C that prevented scurvy during the long months without fresh produce. Dairy preservation required even more sophisticated techniques. Vikings created various fermented milk products that could last for months, including predecessors to modern yogurt and cheese. These fermented foods weren't just preserved nutrition, they were also sources of beneficial bacteria that helped maintain digestive health during a season when diet variety was extremely limited. The preparation and consumption of food became elaborate social rituals that helped maintain community bonds during the isolation of winter. Meals were communal affairs where everyone gathered around the central fire, sharing not just food, but stories, news, and companionship. The seating arrangements followed strict social hierarchies. but the act of eating together reinforced the bonds that held the community together. Cooking techniques had to be adapted to the constraints of longhouse living. Large iron cauldrons hung over the central fire, allowing for the preparation of stews and soups that could feed dozens of people. These weren't just practical solutions. They were culinary innovations that extracted maximum nutrition from limited ingredients, while creating meals that were actually enjoyable, despite the challenging circumstances. The flavoring of food became an art form that relied heavily on preserved herbs and spices gathered during the warmer months. Vikings understood that monotonous food could damage morale just as effectively as inadequate nutrition, so they developed complex seasoning techniques using everything from wild garlic to juniper berries. The result was a winter cuisine that was surprisingly varied and flavorful, given the constraints they faced. Beeric beverages, but also sauces and mead production continued throughout the winter, providing not just alcohol of calories and nutrition. The fermentation process itself generated heat that contributed to warming the longhouse, while the finished products provided essential calories and helped prevent waterborne diseases. Brewing was considered both a practical skill and a sacred art, with master brewers holding positions of respect within their communities. The psychological challenges of winter survival were just as real as the physical ones, and Vikings developed sophisticated strategies for maintaining mental health during the long months of confinement. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was therapy, education, and cultural preservation, all rolled into one essential activity that kept communities sane and connected to their larger identity. The stories told around the winter fires weren't just random tales to pass the time. They were carefully crafted psychological tools that served multiple functions in maintaining community mental health. The sagas that would eventually be written down and preserved for posterity were first perfected during these long winter nights, told and retold by skilled narrators who understood the power of words to transport minds away from the cold, cramped reality of longhouse life. These storytellers, known as skalds, held positions of incredible respect within Viking society. They weren't just entertainers. They were memory keepers, historians, and psychological healers who could take a room full of cabin-fevered, irritable people and transport them to distant lands filled with heroes, monsters, and adventures. A skilled skald could make the walls of the longhouse disappear, replacing them with vast oceans, towering mountains, and the halls of the gods themselves. The stories followed patterns that modern psychologists would recognize as therapeutic. They often featured protagonists facing seemingly impossible challenges, overcoming them through courage, cleverness, and perseverance. These weren't coincidences. Vikings understood, perhaps instinctively, that people trapped in difficult circumstances needed to hear about others who had faced even worse situations and emerged victorious. But storytelling was interactive in ways that modern entertainment isn't. Audiences would call out suggestions, argue about plot points, and sometimes demand that stories be retold with different endings. The same basic tale might be told dozens of different ways throughout the winter, with each version adapted to the mood and needs of the listeners. A story told to lift spirits during a particularly harsh blizzard would emphasize different themes than the same story told during a celebration. Poetry competitions became fierce intellectual battles that could last entire nights. Vikings prized verbal cleverness almost as much as physical prowess, and the ability to compose intricate verses on the spot was considered a mark of true intelligence. These weren't simple rhyming contests. Viking poetry followed complex rules about meter, alliteration, and the use of kennings, metaphorical phrases that required extensive cultural knowledge to understand and create. The competitive aspect of these poetry battles served important social functions. They allowed people to engage in verbal combat that relieved tensions without resorting to physical violence. They also established intellectual hierarchies that complemented the physical and social rankings that governed other aspects of Viking life. A man might be the strongest warrior in the longhouse, But if he couldn't match wits with the clever young woman who could improvise brilliant verses about his exploits, his social standing was incomplete. Music provided another escape from the realities of winter survival. Vikings created instruments from whatever materials were available, crafting flutes from hollow bones, drums from stretched hides, and simple harps from carved wood and twisted gut strings. These weren't sophisticated orchestral instruments, but they served their purpose perfectly, providing rhythmic accompaniment to stories and songs that helped pass the endless dark hours. The music itself was often improvisational, with skilled musicians creating melodies that matched the mood of the evening. Sad songs for nights, when the community mourned lost members, rousing battle songs when spirits needed lifting, and gentle lullabies when children grew restless in the smoky, crowded conditions. Musicians learned to read their audience like modern performers, adjusting their repertoire to provide exactly what the community needed at any given moment. Dancing, when space permitted, became another form of psychological release. The physical movement helped combat the effects of spending months in cramped quarters, while the social interaction reinforced community bonds. These weren't elaborate choreographed performances, but simple, energetic movements that got blood flowing and spirits lifting. Sometimes, entire longhouses would erupt in spontaneous dance parties that lasted until dawn, fueled by Mead and the desperate human need for joy even in the darkest circumstances. Games provided yet another mental escape, and Vikings developed an impressive array of contests that could be played in limited space with simple equipment. Board games like Hnefatafl required strategic thinking that kept minds sharp during the long, inactive months. These weren't just casual entertainment, but serious intellectual challenges that could occupy players for hours at a time. Physical games adapted to indoor constraints became tests of skill and coordination rather than brute strength. Wrestling matches were common, but they followed strict rules to prevent serious injuries that could endanger the entire community. These contests served multiple purposes, providing physical exercise, establishing social rankings, and offering entertainment for spectators who gathered around makeshift wrestling areas cleared near the central fire. Gambling added excitement to otherwise routine evenings, with Vikings betting everything from food portions to future work obligations on the outcomes of dice games and contests of skill. The stakes were usually small enough that losses wouldn't threaten survival, but large enough to make victories meaningful. These games served as informal systems for redistributing resources within the community, ensuring that lucky winners shared their good fortune, while unlucky losers received help from others. The psychological importance of maintaining hope during the darkest months cannot be overstated. Vikings developed elaborate rituals around the winter solstice that served to remind everyone that the days were beginning to lengthen again, even if imperceptibly. These weren't just religious observances, but carefully crafted psychological interventions designed to combat the depression and despair that could destroy communities from within. The preparation for these midwinter celebrations began weeks in advance, giving everyone something to look forward to during the bleakest part of the season. Food was saved, special clothing was prepared, and elaborate plans were made for feasts and ceremonies that would mark the turning of the year. The anticipation itself served a therapeutic function, providing a psychological countdown that helped people endure the worst of winter. Yule, the great midwinter festival, represented the culmination of these psychological survival strategies. For 12 days, normal rules were suspended, stored food was consumed with abandon, and the entire community engaged in a celebration that was part religious observance, part psychological therapy, and part desperate attempt to prove that they were still alive and human, despite months of hardship. The feasting during Yule wasn't just about enjoying good food and drink, though that was certainly important. It was about demonstrating to themselves and their gods that they had successfully managed their resources well enough to survive another winter. The abundance displayed during these celebrations was proof of the community's skill, planning, and cooperation throughout the previous year. Gift-giving during Yule served multiple functions beyond simple generosity. It reinforced social bonds, redistributed wealth within the community, and provided opportunities for people to demonstrate their craftsmanship and creativity. The gifts themselves were often practical items that recipients could use throughout the coming year, making the exchange both emotionally meaningful and practically beneficial. The religious aspects of winter survival were deeply intertwined with practical concerns in ways that modern people might find difficult to understand. Vikings didn't separate their spiritual beliefs from their survival strategies. Their gods weren't distant figures to be worshipped on special occasions, but active participants in daily life who needed to be consulted, appeased, and honored if the community was to survive the winter. Odin, the All-Father, was particularly important during winter months. He was associated with wisdom, magic, and the ability to see beyond the immediate circumstances to perceive larger patterns and meanings. Vikings would offer sacrifices to Odin, seeking his guidance in making the crucial decisions that determined whether communities lived or died. These weren't superstitious practices, but integral parts of decision-making processes that helped leaders consider all aspects of complex survival situations. Frigg, Odin's wife, was honored as the protector of households and families. Her blessing was sought for the Longhouse itself, the central fire, and the people who depended on both for survival. Rituals honoring Frigg often involved the hearth and the activities that took place around it, reinforcing the sacred nature of the fire that kept everyone alive. Thor, the thunder god, was invoked for protection against the supernatural threats that seemed more real during the long, dark nights of winter. His hammer was a symbol of the strength needed to endure hardship, and his battles against giants and monsters provided metaphorical frameworks for understanding the struggle against winter itself. The practice of making offerings to these gods wasn't just about seeking divine intervention. It was also about reinforcing community values and shared beliefs that helped hold people together during times of stress. The rituals themselves provided structure to otherwise shapeless days, giving people regular activities that connected them to something larger than their immediate circumstances. Divination practices during winter serve both spiritual and practical functions. Reading runes, interpreting dreams, and observing natural omens provided frameworks for making decisions about resource allocation, conflict resolution, and planning for the coming seasons. These practices helped people feel that they had some control over their circumstances, even when facing forces far beyond their individual power. The role of women in winter spiritual practices was particularly important. Many of the rituals associated with household protection, food blessing, and community healing were led by women who served as informal priestesses within their communities. These women possessed knowledge of herbal medicine, spiritual practices, and social management that was essential for survival, but often went unrecorded in the male-dominated written sources that have survived to modern times. The integration of spiritual and practical concerns meant that winter survival was understood as a sacred responsibility that required both human effort and divine assistance. Communities that successfully endured the dark months had fulfilled both their practical obligations to prepare and work together, and their spiritual obligations to honor the gods and maintain proper relationships with the supernatural forces that governed their world. Sleep itself became a carefully managed resource during winter months. The long nights meant that people could potentially sleep for 12 or more hours, but the cramped conditions and need to maintain the fire meant that sleep had to be coordinated and scheduled like any other survival activity. Families developed elaborate systems for taking turns tending the fire, ensuring that someone was always awake to monitor the flame that kept everyone alive. The sleeping arrangements reflected both practical needs and social hierarchies. The warmest spots near the fire were reserved for the most vulnerable members of the community, particularly small children and elderly people who were most at risk from the cold. Everyone else arranged themselves in careful patterns that maximized warmth sharing while minimizing conflicts over space and comfort. Bedding consisted primarily of layers of animal furs and woven blankets, with the quality and quantity of covering determining how comfortable each person would be during the long nights. Families with more resources could provide better bedding for their members, but community obligations meant that no one was allowed to freeze while others slept in luxury. Dreams and nightmares took on a special significance during winter months, when the boundary between waking and sleeping became blurred by the constant darkness. Vikings believed that dreams during winter were particularly meaningful, often containing messages from gods or deceased ancestors who were trying to provide guidance for surviving the harsh season. The interpretation of winter dreams became a specialized skill practiced by certain individuals within each community. These dream readers helped people understand the symbolic meanings of their nighttime visions and provided psychological counseling that helped maintain mental health during the stressful winter months. The management of human waste during winter presented challenges that required both practical solutions and social protocols. Chamber pots and designated areas within the longhouse handled immediate needs, but the frozen ground outside made normal disposal methods impossible. Vikings developed systems for storing waste until spring thaws allowed proper disposal, managing this unpleasant necessity with the same attention to detail they applied to other aspects of survival. Personal hygiene during winter was limited by the scarcity of water and the need to conserve heat, but Vikings understood that cleanliness was connected to health and morale. They developed dry cleaning techniques using sand and ash to remove dirt and oils from skin and hair, while heated stones could provide warmth for limited washing when water was available. The social protocols around personal hygiene reflected both practical constraints and cultural values. Standards were lowered during winter months out of necessity, but communities still maintained expectations about basic cleanliness and consideration for others sharing cramped living spaces. Conflict resolution during winter required special attention because violent disputes could threaten the survival of entire communities. Vikings developed sophisticated systems for managing disagreements that emphasized restoration of harmony rather than punishment of wrongdoers. These systems recognized that everyone needed to work together if any were to survive, making traditional justice approaches counterproductive during winter months. The role of community elders in managing winter conflicts was particularly important. These individuals possessed the wisdom and authority needed to mediate disputes while maintaining the social cohesion essential for survival. Their decisions were generally accepted because everyone understood that community breakdown during winter meant death for all. As we've seen, surviving a Viking winter night required far more than just staying warm. It demanded the creation of entire social, economic, and cultural systems designed to maintain not just physical life, but human dignity and community bonds under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The Vikings who mastered these systems didn't just survive their brutal winters. They used them as foundations for building one of history's most successful maritime civilizations. But we've only just begun to explore the depths of Viking winter survival. The techniques they developed for managing food storage, the sophisticated understanding they possessed of human psychology under stress, and the ingenious methods they created for maintaining health and morale during months of darkness reveal layers of complexity that continue to amaze modern researchers. The complexity of Viking winter survival extended far beyond the basic necessities of warmth and food. These aspects of human existence during months when northern warriors developed intricate systems for managing the outside world became a frozen wasteland of resource management and community death. Their understanding of human nature dynamics was so sophisticated that modern sociologists still study their methods for maintaining social cohesion under extreme stress. Considerity. When 50 people are CR, the challenge of maintaining sanamd into a space roughly the size of a modern basketball court, breathing to each other's every conversation, the same smoky air, listening and sharing their living quarters with livestock that haven't been bathed in months. The psychological pressure alone would drive most modern people to violence within days. Yet Vikings not only endured these conditions, but created some of their greatest cultural achievements during these forced periods of intimacy. The secret lay in their understanding that winter survival wasn't just about keeping the human bodies alive. It was about preserved spirit and maintaining the complex web of relationships that held their society together. They developed elaborate social technologies that were every bit as sophisticated as their physical survival techniques, creating invisible but crucial systems for managing everything from sexual tensions to generational conflicts within the confines of the Longhouse. Privacy, as we understand it, simply couldn't exist in these conditions. Every intimate conversation between spouses was overheard by children, parents, and neighbors. Every argument echoed through the smoky air for everyone to witness. Every personal struggle became community knowledge, whether people wanted to share it or not. Vikings responded to this challenge by developing cultural protocols that were simultaneously more open and more discreet than anything in modern society. They created elaborate systems of polite ignorance where people learned to mentally tune out conversations happening mere feet away. They developed subtle forms of communication that allowed private conversations to occur in public spaces through coded language, meaningful glances, and carefully timed gestures. Most importantly, they established community standards that made certain topics and behaviors off-limits during winter months, recognizing that some conflicts were too dangerous to indulge when everyone's survival depended on cooperation. The management of romantic and sexual relationships during winter confinement required particularly delicate handling. Young people coming of age couldn't simply wander off to find privacy for courtship or experimentation. Married couples couldn't retreat to separate bedrooms when they needed space from each other. The normal outlets for sexual tension and romantic drama were completely unavailable, creating potential powder kegs that could explode into community challenges through a combination of cultural destroying violence. Vikings addressed these flexibility and strict behavioral codes. They were remarkably open about human sexuality compared to many other medieval cultures, acknowledging that physical needs didn't disappear just because conditions were challenging. At the same time, they established clear boundaries about when, where, and how intimate disrupting community harmony. The positioning activities could occur without of sleeping areas within the longhouse reflected these concerns. Newly married couples might be given spaces that offered slightly, while unmarried young more privacy. People were placed under the watchful eyes of elders who could intervene if attractions threatened to disrupt the careful social balance. These arrangements weren't just about moral propriety. They were about preventing the kind of romantic conflicts that could tear apart the cooperation essential for survival. Marriage negotiations often took place during winter months, when families had time to discuss arrangements and evaluate potential matches. These weren't just romantic decisions, but strategic alliances that would affect entire extended families for generations. The confined conditions of winter living actually provided ideal opportunities for families to observe how potential spouses behaved under stress, how they contributed to community work, and how they interacted with children and elders. The role of women in maintaining winter social harmony cannot be overstated. While men might hold formal authority in many aspects of Viking society, women often wielded the real power when it came to managing the complex interpersonal dynamics that determined whether communities survived or destroyed themselves during winter months. They served as informal mediators, counselors, and social engineers who could diffuse tensions before they exploded into violence. These women possessed sophisticated understanding of human psychology that would impress modern therapists. They knew how to redirect anger into productive channels, how to provide emotional support without creating dependency, and how to maintain their own authority while respecting the formal hierarchy that governed community decision-making. Their skills were learned through generations of experience managing the unique challenges of winter survival. The education of children during winter months became a community responsibility that went far beyond simple childcare. With normal outdoor activities impossible and formal schooling centuries in the future, Vikings developed innovative approaches to child development that combined practical skill training with cultural education and psychological preparation for adult responsibilities. Children weren't just kept busy with make-work activities. They were integrated into the essential work of survival in age-appropriate ways that taught them the skills they would need as adults while young children might contributing meaningfully to community welfare be responsible for feeding chickens or entertained adults also served crucial practitioners. The storytelling that working under the supervision of mastered complex crafts like weaving or metal, carrying messages between adults. Older children learn educational functions for children. The sagas and legends weren't just entertainment, but carefully constructed teaching tools that transmitted cultural values, historical knowledge, and practical wisdom across generations. Children learned about heroic behavior, proper social relationships, more engaging than any lecture. And the consequences of various choices could be the competitive, through stories that were far games that helped adults maintain their sanity, also served to develop children's physical and mental capabilities. Wrestling matches taught combat skills and physical conditioning. Board games developed strategic thinking and patience. Riddle contests improved verbal abilities and cultural knowledge. These activities weren't just fun diversions, but systematic preparation for the challenges children would face as adults. The treatment of elderly community members during winter months reflected Viking values about wisdom, respect, and social obligation in their purest form. When resources were scarce and space was limited, many societies might view the elderly as burdens to be endured or discarded. Vikings took the opposite approach, recognizing that their elders possessed irreplaceable knowledge and experience that could mean the difference between community survival and destruction. Elderly Vikings weren't just provided with warm spots near the fire out of charity. They were honored as living libraries whose memories contained crucial information about previous harsh winters, successful survival strategies, and the mistakes that had led to disasters in the past. Their stories weren't just entertainment, but vital intelligence about what worked and what didn't when communities faced extreme challenges. The positioning of elders within the social hierarchy of the Longhouse reflected their valued status. They received priority access to food, warmth, and comfort, not just because they were vulnerable, but because their survival ensured the preservation of cultural knowledge that couldn't be replaced. A community that lost its elders during winter didn't just lose beloved family members. It lost decades or centuries of accumulated wisdom about survival. The medical knowledge possessed by elderly women was particularly crucial during winter months when injuries and illnesses occurred frequently, but access to outside help was impossible. These women served as the community's doctors, midwives, and pharmacists, using herbal remedies and traditional treatments that had been refined over generations of practice. Their understanding of human anatomy, disease progression, and treatment options was often remarkably sophisticated, despite the lack of formal medical training. They could set broken bones, treat infections, assist with difficult births, and manage the countless minor injuries and illnesses that occurred when dozens of people lived in close proximity for months at a time. The preparation of medicines during winter months required extensive knowledge of plant identification, proper harvesting techniques, and storage methods that would preserve therapeutic properties throughout the dark season. These elderly healers maintained carefully organized collections of dried herbs, prepared tinctures, and specialized tools that represented the community's entire medical infrastructure. Mental health treatment was another area where elderly wisdom proved invaluable. These experienced community members could recognize the signs of seasonal depression, cabin fever, and the various psychological disorders that could develop during extended periods of confinement. They possessed traditional techniques for managing these conditions that combined practical intervention with spiritual counseling. The integration of spiritual and medical healing reflected Viking understanding that physical and mental health were inseparably connected. Elderly healers often served dual roles as medical practitioners and spiritual advisors, providing both herbal treatments and religious guidance to community members struggling with various ailments. The economic systems that governed resource allocation during winter months required constant adjustment and sophisticated understanding of human nature under stress. Vikings couldn't simply rely on market mechanisms or formal legal structures to ensure fair distribution of scarce resources. They needed flexible systems that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining community cohesion. Food rationing was perhaps the most critical and delicate aspect of winter resource management. Communities had to balance the need to conserve stores for the entire winter against the requirement to maintain everyone's strength and morale. Too little food and people would become weak and susceptible to disease. Too much early consumption and the community might face starvation before spring arrived. The calculations involved were incredibly complex, requiring detailed knowledge of how much food each person needed, based on their age, size, activity level, and contribution to community welfare. Pregnant women needed extra nutrition, as did people engaged in heavy physical work like maintaining the fire or caring for livestock. Children required different nutritional balances than adults, and elderly people often needed softer foods that were easier to digest. These decisions couldn't be made by simple mathematical formulas because human needs varied constantly based on health, weather conditions, and countless other factors. Successful communities developed flexible rationing systems that could be adjusted based on changing circumstances while maintaining principles of fairness that everyone understood and accepted. The psychological aspects of food distribution were just as important as the nutritional considerations. People needed to feel that they were being treated fairly and that their contributions to community welfare were being recognized. A brilliant hunter who provided meat for the entire community deserved recognition in the form of choice portions. A skilled craftsperson whose work benefited everyone needed to see that their efforts were valued through appropriate food allocation. The management of fuel resources required similar sophistication and constant attention. Wood consumption had to be carefully monitored to ensure that supplies lasted through the entire winter while maintaining adequate heat for survival. This meant making difficult decisions about when to burn precious fuel for comfort versus conservation for later emergencies. Different types of wood had to be allocated based on their specific properties and the community's immediate needs. The best burning wood might be saved for the coldest nights, while less efficient fuel was used during milder periods. Special occasions like religious celebrations or community gatherings might justify burning premium wood to create the heat and light needed for successful events. The social dynamics of fuel management reflected broader community values about sharing, conservation, and mutual responsibility. Everyone understood that wasting fuel endangered the entire community, but people also needed to feel that their individual needs and contributions were being considered in allocation decisions. Tool and equipment sharing became another complex logistical challenge during winter months, when everyone needed access to limited resources, but space and ownership created potential conflicts. A single longhouse might contain only a few metal knives, axes, or other essential tools that multiple people needed simultaneously for their work. Vikings developed elaborate, balanced individual needs against systems for scheduling tool use that community welfare. Priority systems ensured that the most critical work received first access to necessary tools, while rotation schedules gave everyone fair opportunities to complete their personal projects. These systems required constant negotiation and adjustment as circumstances changed and new needs arose. The maintenance of tools and equipment became a community responsibility that required specialized knowledge and careful coordination. Metal tools needed regular sharpening and rust prevention. Wooden implements required repairs and replacement of worn parts. These maintenance tasks had to be scheduled around the normal use of the tools while ensuring that essential equipment remained functional throughout the winter. The creation of new tools during winter months provided opportunities for skilled craftspeople to improve the community's overall capabilities while also demonstrating their value to the group. A blacksmith who could forge new knives or repair damaged axes earned respect and better treatment through their contributions to community welfare. The storage and organisation of personal possessions within the cramped confines of the longhouse required systems that balanced individual privacy needs against space limitations and community access requirements. People needed places to keep their personal belongings secure, while also contributing to the overall organisation and cleanliness of the shared living space. Vikings developed innovative storage solutions that maximised the use of vertical space while keeping personal items accessible to their owners. Hanging bags, built-in shelves, and designated storage areas allowed people to maintain some sense of personal space and ownership within the communal environment. The social protocols governing access to other people's possessions reflected cultural values about respect, trust, and mutual dependence. While privacy was limited, theft was virtually unthinkable because everyone's survival depended on maintaining community trust and cooperation. The violation of these trust relationships could result in exile, which during winter months was essentially a death sentence. The organisation of work schedules during winter months required sophisticated understanding of human psychology, skill development, and resource management. Communities had to balance the need to complete essential survival tasks against the importance of maintaining morale and preventing the conflicts that could arise from boredom or perceived unfairness in work assignments. Different types of work had to be coordinated to ensure that essential tasks received priority, while also providing opportunities for people to develop new skills and contribute in meaningful ways. The scheduling had to account for individual capabilities, available tools and materials, and the complex interdependencies between different activities. The rotation of unpleasant but necessary tasks like waste management, fire tending, and animal care ensured that no individual bore an unfair burden of the community's least desirable work. These rotation systems had to be carefully designed to maintain fairness, while also ensuring that critical tasks were performed by people with appropriate skills and reliability. The recognition and reward systems that motivated people to perform their assigned work effectively required subtle understanding of human motivation and social dynamics. People needed to feel that their contributions were valued and that their efforts were making meaningful differences to community welfare, even when the work itself was routine or unpleasant. The coordination of group projects that required multiple people working together created opportunities for community bonding while also accomplishing important survival tasks. The construction of new storage facilities, the repair of structural damage, or the processing of large quantities of preserved food brought people together in collaborative efforts that strengthened social bonds while improving community capabilities. These group activities required leadership skills that balanced technical expertise with social management capabilities. Project leaders had to coordinate the work of people with different skill levels while maintaining harmony and motivation throughout the completion of complex tasks. The celebration of completed projects provided important psychological rewards that reinforced community values about cooperation, achievement, and shared success. These celebrations didn't require elaborate resources, but rather recognition of the collective effort that made community survival possible. As the darkest depths of winter settled over the Longhouse communities, Vikings found themselves facing challenges that tested not just their physical endurance, but their very humanity. The techniques they had developed weren't just survival mechanisms, but sophisticated social technologies that allowed human beings to maintain their dignity, relationships, and cultural identity under conditions that would have destroyed less resilient societies. The management of water during winter months presented challenges that required both engineering ingenuity and careful social coordination. With outdoor sources frozen solid for months at a time, Vikings had to develop systems for obtaining, storing, and conserving this most basic necessity of life. They couldn't simply turn a tap or walk to a nearby well when they needed water for cooking, cleaning, or drinking. Snow became their primary water source, but converting snow to usable water wasn't as simple as it might seem. Fresh snow contains surprisingly little actual water content, meaning that large quantities had to be collected and melted to produce even small amounts of liquid. The process required careful fuel management since melting snow consumed precious firewood that was needed for heating and cooking. Vikings developed specialized techniques for snow collection that maximized water yield while minimizing the effort required. They learned to identify the types the light, powdery snow that require of snow that contained the most water, avoiding enormous amounts to produce small quantities of water. Dense, packed snow provided much better results, but it was also harder to collect and transport. The melting process itself required sophisticated understanding of heat management and fuel efficiency. Simply throwing snow into a pot over the fire was wasteful and inefficient. Instead, Vikings developed techniques that allowed them to melt snow gradually while using the minimum amount of fuel necessary. They learned to add small amounts of snow to already warm water, allowing the existing heat to melt the new snow without requiring additional fire. Storage of melted snow water presented its own challenges. Large quantities of water were heavy and took up valuable space within the cramped confines of the longhouse. Water containers had to be positioned where they wouldn't freeze again, but also where they wouldn't interfere with the daily activities of the community. Vikings used everything from wooden barrels to animal bladders as water containers, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. The quality of water obtained from melted snow varied significantly depending on where the snow was collected and how it was processed. Snow gathered from areas near the longhouse might be contaminated with ash from the smoke hole or other pollutants. Fresh snow from distant, clean areas provided better quality water, but required more effort to collect and transport. Vikings also developed techniques for improving water quality through filtration and treatment. They understood that clear water wasn't necessarily safe water, and they developed methods for removing visible impurities, while also treating water to make it safer for consumption. Sand filtration, boiling, and the addition of certain herbs helped ensure that their precious water supply didn't become a source of disease. The rationing of water required even more careful management than food rationing. People could survive longer without food than without water, but water was much harder to obtain during winter months. Communities had to balance the need to conserve their limited water supplies against the requirement to maintain hygiene, prepare food, and support the various craft activities that kept people occupied during the long winter nights. Washing and cleaning during winter months required innovative approaches that conserved water while maintaining the minimal hygiene standards necessary for health and social harmony. Vikings developed dry cleaning techniques using sand, ash, and other abrasive materials to remove dirt and oils from skin and clothing without requiring large amounts of precious water. Personal washing became a carefully planned activity that maximized the benefit of small amounts of heated water. Vikings learned to wash efficiently, using minimal water for maximum cleansing effect. They developed techniques for reusing wash water for multiple purposes, with the same water serving first for personal washing, then for cleaning utensils, and finally for other household tasks before being discarded. The heating of water for washing required additional fuel consumption that had to be balanced against other heating needs. Communities developed schedules for heating wash water that coordinated multiple people's needs while minimizing fuel waste. These bathing schedules became important social activities that provided opportunities for community bonding while also maintaining necessary hygiene standards. Laundry presented even greater challenges since clothing and textiles required much larger quantities of water than personal washing. Vikings had to develop techniques for cleaning clothing that used minimal water, while still removing the accumulated dirt, sweat, and odors that made garments unwearable. They learned to spot clean heavily soiled areas, while leaving the rest of the garment untouched. conserving water while maintaining reasonable cleanliness. The drying of washed items in the humid, smoky environment of the longhouse required careful positioning and timing. Wet clothing had to be placed where it would dry without interfering with other activities, while also avoiding areas where it might absorb additional smoke or odours. The process could take days in the humid conditions, requiring patience and careful management of the limited space available for hanging wet items. Cooking with limited water supplies forced Vikings to develop culinary techniques that maximised nutrition while minimising water consumption. Stews and soups that used minimal water while extracting maximum nutrition from available ingredients became staples of winter cuisine. These one-pot meals conserved both water and fuel while providing the hot, nutritious food necessary for survival. Food preparation techniques evolved to minimize water waste while maintaining food safety and palatability. Vikings learned to clean and prepare ingredients using minimal water, saving the precious liquid for cooking processes that absolutely required it. They developed techniques for reusing cooking water, with the liquid used for preparing one dish serving as the base for subsequent meals. The brewing of ale and mead continued throughout winter months, but these processes had to be adapted to water conservation requirements. Brewers developed techniques that used minimal water while still producing the fermented beverages that provided both nutrition and psychological comfort during the harsh winter months. The brewing process itself generated some heat, contributing to the overall warmth of the longhouse while producing essential beverages. Wastewater management became crucial for maintaining sanitary conditions within the longhouse while also conserving water resources. Vikings developed systems for collecting and treating wastewater that allowed them to reuse water multiple times before final disposal. Grey water from washing and cooking was often used for cleaning floors or other household tasks before being discarded. The disposal of wastewater presented challenges in the frozen winter environment. Liquid waste couldn't simply be poured outside, where it would create ice hazards or contaminate snow that might later be collected for water. Vikings had to develop waste disposal systems that managed liquid waste safely while preventing contamination of their living environment. The psychological aspects of water scarcity affected community morale in ways that required careful management. People accustomed to having adequate water for all their needs had to adjust to rationing and conservation measures that felt restrictive and uncomfortable. Community leaders had to maintain water discipline while also ensuring that people didn't feel deprived of basic necessities. The social protocols around water use reflected community values about sharing, conservation, and mutual responsibility. Everyone understood that wasting water endangered the entire community, but the allocation of limited water supplies for different uses required constant negotiation and adjustment based on changing needs and circumstances. Emergency water reserves were maintained for crisis situations when normal water collection became impossible due to extreme weather or other emergencies. These reserves were carefully protected and monitored, with strict protocols governing their use. The management of emergency water supplies required balancing the need to save water for true emergencies against the temptation to use reserves during routine shortages. The procurement of water during extreme weather events required specialized techniques and equipment that allowed people to collect snow and ice even during blizzards or other dangerous conditions. Vikings developed methods for gathering water that minimized exposure to deadly weather while still obtaining the water necessary for survival. The maintenance of water collection and storage equipment required ongoing attention throughout the winter months. Water containers needed regular cleaning and repair to prevent contamination and leakage. The tools used for snow collection had to be maintained in working condition despite constant use in harsh conditions. The teaching of water management skills to younger community members ensured that knowledge about water conservation and collection techniques was passed down through generations. Children learned not just the practical skills needed for water management, but also the cultural values about conservation and sharing that made community survival possible. Trade relationships with neighboring communities sometimes included agreements for sharing water resources during emergencies. These arrangements required careful negotiation and mutual trust, with communities agreeing to help each other during crisis situations while maintaining their own water security. The innovation of water management techniques continued throughout the winter as communities faced new challenges and developed creative solutions. Vikings constantly refined their methods for collecting, storing, and using water, sharing successful innovations with other community members, and adapting techniques based on changing circumstances. The spiritual significance of water in Viking culture influenced how communities approached water management during winter months. Water was seen not just as a practical necessity, but as a sacred element that connected people to the natural world and the gods. Rituals around water use and conservation reflected these spiritual beliefs, while also serving practical purposes. The relationship between water management and other aspects of winter survival created complex interdependencies that required careful coordination. Water was needed for food preparation, tool maintenance, textile work, and countless other activities that kept the community functioning. The allocation of limited water supplies among these competing needs required sophisticated understanding of priorities and trade-offs. Fire management during the deepest winter months became an art form that required constant vigilance and sophisticated understanding of combustion science. The central hearth wasn't just a source of heat and light, but the beating heart of community survival, requiring attention that bordered on religious devotion. The fire could never be allowed to die completely, not even for a few minutes, because restarting a fire from scratch in extreme cold could prove impossible. The overnight fire tending schedule rotated among community members based on their reliability, experience, and physical capability. This wasn't casual duty, but a sacred responsibility that could determine whether everyone woke up alive in the morning. Fire tenders had to understand exactly how to add fuel without smothering the flames, how to adjust airflow to maintain optimal burning, and how to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when the fire needed attention. Different weather conditions required different fire management techniques. During blizzards, snow could blow down through the smoke hole and threaten to extinguish the flames. High winds could create dangerous updrafts that pulled too much heat up and out of the longhouse. Extremely cold temperatures made the fire burn differently, requiring adjustments to fuel types and feeding schedules that experienced fire tenders learned through years of practice. The selection and preparation of fuel became a precise science that involved understanding the burning characteristics of different wood types under various conditions. Green wood provided long, steady burns but produced more smoke. Seasoned hardwoods burned hot and clean but consumed quickly. Softwoods ignited easily but could burn too fast if not managed properly. Each type of fuel had its place in the carefully orchestrated dance of fire management. The storage of fuel within the longhouse required balancing accessibility against space limitations and fire safety. Wood had to be kept dry and easily accessible to fire tenders, while also being stored safely away from the flames themselves. Vikings developed ingenious storage systems that kept fuel organized and ready for use, while minimizing the risk of accidental fires that could destroy the entire community. The processing of fuel during winter months provided essential work that kept people occupied while also ensuring adequate supplies for the fire. Splitting kindling, organizing wood by size and type, and preparing special fuel for different purposes required skills that were passed down through generations of fire management experience. The relationship between the fire and the smoke hole above required constant adjustment based on weather conditions and fuel types. The smoke hole couldn't be too large or precious heat would escape, but it couldn't be too small or dangerous. Smoke would accumulate inside the longhouse. Vikings developed adjustable covers and deflectors that could be modified to optimize the balance between heat retention and smoke removal. Emergency fire procedures were essential knowledge that every community member had to master. If the main fire was threatened by accident or extreme weather, Everyone needed to know how to quickly establish backup fires, how to transfer coals safely, and how to restart fires from minimal materials. These emergency procedures were practiced regularly to ensure that they could be executed effectively under stress. The psychological relationship between the community and their fire went far beyond practical concerns. The flames represented life, hope, and continuity in the face of the deadly cold outside. The sound of crackling wood provided comfort and reassurance during long, dark nights. The dancing light created an atmosphere that transformed the smoky, crowded longhouse into something approaching coziness. Fire rituals and ceremonies marked important occasions throughout the winter months. Special woods might be burned during religious observances, creating distinctive scents and flame colors that enhanced the spiritual significance of the events. The fire served as an altar where offerings could be made to gods and ancestors, connecting the community to spiritual forces that governed their survival. The maintenance of secondary fires for specialized purposes required additional fuel and management, but provided crucial capabilities for the community. Forge fires for metalworking, small fires for specific cooking tasks, and emergency backup fires all required their own fuel supplies and tending schedules that had to be coordinated with the management of the main hearth. The teaching of fire management skills to young people represented one of the most important educational responsibilities in Viking society. Children learned to recognize different flame characteristics, understand fuel properties, and develop the patience and attention to detail necessary for effective fire tending. These skills were literally matters of life and death that had to be mastered before young people could be trusted with fire responsibilities. The social dynamics around fire management reflected broader community hierarchies and relationships. Skilled fire tenders earned respect and privileged positions within the community. The assignment of fire duties became a way of recognizing trust and responsibility, while also ensuring that the most critical survival task was handled by reliable people. The innovation of fire management techniques continued throughout each winter as communities faced new challenges and developed creative solutions. New fuel combinations, improved ventilation methods, and enhanced safety procedures were constantly being tested and refined by experienced fire managers who understood that even small improvements could have significant impacts on survival. The coordination between fire management and other community activities required careful scheduling and communication. Cooking schedules had to be coordinated with fuel availability. Craftwork that required good light had to be planned around fire intensity. Social gatherings needed adequate heat and light that required advanced preparation and additional fuel allocation. The health impacts of fire management extended beyond simple warmth to include air quality considerations that affected everyone's well-being. The balance between adequate heat and acceptable air quality required constant adjustment based on fuel types, weather conditions, and the health status of community members who might be particularly sensitive to smoke. The economic aspects of fire management involved complex calculations about fuel consumption rates, available supplies, and conservation strategies that had to balance current needs against future requirements. Communities had to carefully ration their fuel supplies while ensuring that current fire management needs were met adequately to prevent emergency situations. The spiritual significance of fire in Viking cosmology influenced every aspect of fire management practices. Fire was seen as a connection to the gods, particularly to the forces of light and warmth that opposed the deadly cold and darkness of winter. The maintenance of the community fire became a religious duty that connected practical survival activities to deeper spiritual beliefs about the relationship between humans and the natural world. The development of specialized fire management tools and equipment represented significant investments of time and materials that reflected the critical importance of fire tending. Special pokers, bellows, fuel containers, and safety equipment were crafted by skilled artisans who understood that the quality of fire management tools could determine community survival. Human health and medical care during winter months required sophisticated understanding of cold weather ailments and treatment options that could be implemented with limited resources. Vikings developed comprehensive medical knowledge that addressed both the physical and psychological challenges of surviving in extreme cold while living in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Respiratory problems were among the most common health challenges faced during winter months. The combination of cold air, smoke from the central fire, and close proximity to many other people created ideal conditions for the spread of coughs, colds, and more serious lung infections. Viking healers developed treatments using herbal remedies, steam inhalation, and dietary modifications that helped manage these conditions with varying degrees of success. Skin conditions flourished in the winter environment, where regular washing was difficult and people wore the same clothing for extended periods. Vikings learned to recognize and treat various rashes, infections, and injuries that resulted from prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions and constant contact with rough textiles and unwashed bedding. Digestive problems were common due to the limited diet of preserved foods that lacked the variety and freshness that supported optimal digestive health. Healers developed treatments for stomach ailments, constipation, and nutritional deficiencies using herbal remedies and dietary adjustments that worked within the constraints of available winter foods. Injuries were frequent in the crowded conditions of the longhouse, where people worked with sharp tools in limited light while wearing bulky clothing that restricted their movement. Cuts, burns, bruises, and more serious injuries required immediate treatment using traditional medical techniques that had been refined through generations of practice. The treatment of wounds during winter presented special challenges, since healing was slower in cold conditions and the risk of infection was higher due to unsanitary living conditions. Viking healers developed wound care protocols that emphasized cleanliness as much as possible, while using herbal antiseptics and other treatments to promote healing and prevent complications. Bone injuries were particularly problematic during winter months, when people couldn't easily travel to seek specialized treatment from more experienced healers. Community healers had to be able to set broken bones, treat dislocations, and manage other orthopedic injuries using traditional techniques and improvised materials. Mental health treatment was perhaps even more important than physical medical care during the challenging winter months. Vikings recognized that the stress of confinement, limited sunlight, and constant worry about survival could lead to serious psychological problems that threatened both individual well-being and community harmony. Seasonal depression was a recognized condition that required active management through social support, light therapy using reflected firelight, and engaging activities that helped maintain mental stimulation and social connection. Communities developed strategies for identifying and supporting people who were struggling with depression before their conditions became severe enough to threaten community stability. Anxiety and panic disorders were also common responses to the stress of winter survival, particularly among people who were experiencing their first harsh winter, or who had survived previous winters that involved serious hardships. Healers developed calming techniques using herbal remedies, breathing exercises, and counseling approaches that help people manage their anxiety. The treatment of alcohol-related problems became necessary in communities where fermented beverages were used both for nutrition and for psychological comfort during difficult times. Vikings had to balance the benefits of alcohol consumption against the risks of dependency and the behavioral problems that could result from excessive drinking in close quarters. Childhood illnesses required special attention, since children were particularly vulnerable to the diseases that spread rapidly in crowded living conditions. Viking healers developed pediatric treatment protocols that addressed the unique needs of young patients while also protecting other community members from contagious diseases. Women's health issues, particularly those related to pregnancy and childbirth, presented special challenges during winter months when access to specialized care was limited and environmental conditions were far from optimal for recovery from childbirth or other reproductive health issues. The management of chronic health conditions required long-term treatment strategies that could be maintained throughout the winter months using available resources. People with ongoing health problems needed continuous care that didn't overwhelm the community's limited medical resources while still providing effective treatment. Preventive medicine became crucial for maintaining community health when treatment options were limited, and the consequences of serious illness could threaten not just individual patients, but the entire community's survival. Vikings developed hygiene practices, dietary recommendations, and lifestyle modifications that helped prevent illness before treatment became necessary. The preparation and storage of medical supplies required extensive planning and specialized knowledge about which remedies would be needed during winter months and how to preserve their effectiveness throughout the long season. Healers had to maintain comprehensive medicine supplies that could address a wide range of potential health problems. The training of medical assistants and backup healers ensured that communities weren't entirely dependent on single individuals for medical care. The knowledge needed for effective treatment of common winter ailments was shared among multiple community members, who could provide care if the primary healer became ill or incapacitated. The integration of spiritual and medical healing reflected Viking understanding that physical and mental health were inseparably connected to spiritual well-being. Medical treatment often included religious elements that addressed patients' spiritual needs, while also providing psychological comfort that supported physical healing. The social aspects of medical care involved the entire community in supporting sick individuals, while also protecting healthy community members from contagious diseases. These social protocols required balancing compassion for the sick against the practical need to prevent the spread of illness that could devastate the entire community. The documentation of medical knowledge through treatments were preserved, and past oral tradition ensured that effective down through generations of healers who refined and improved medical practices based on their experience with winter health challenges. Winter represented the ultimate test of every system, every relationship, and every innovation that Vikings had developed for survival in their harsh northern homeland. Those who mastered these challenges didn't just survive to see another spring. They built the foundations for a civilization that would expand across oceans and leave its mark on history for centuries to come. But the techniques we've explored so far represent only the beginning of Viking winter mastery. The sophisticated systems they developed for managing everything from interpersonal conflicts to resource allocation revealed depths of human ingenuity and social cooperation that continue to astound modern researchers who study these remarkable people. The true measure of Viking winter survival wasn't just staying alive until spring returned. It was maintaining the cultural vitality, social bonds, and individual dignity that made life worth living even under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. In the depths of winter darkness, surrounded by howling winds and deadly cold, Vikings found ways to create light, warmth, and hope that sustained both their bodies and their spirits through the longest nights of the year. The complexity of maintaining livestock during winter months required understanding that went far beyond simple animal husbandry. Vikings weren't just keeping cows and sheep alive until spring. They were managing living, breathing heating systems that happened to also provide milk, wool, and eventual meat. These animals became integrated members of the household whose survival was just as critical as any human resident. The positioning of animals within the longhouse followed careful hierarchies based on their value, size, and the amount of heat they generated. Cows, being the largest and warmest, often received premium real estate close to the human sleeping areas. Their massive bodies radiated heat like furry furnaces, and a single healthy cow could raise the temperature of an entire section of the longhouse by several precious degrees. Sheep clustered together in groups that amplified their collective warmth, while also providing easy access for milking and wool collection. But managing livestock indoors created challenges that would horrify modern pet owners. These weren't house-trained animals. They relieved themselves wherever they happened to be standing, creating a constant need for waste management that had to be balanced against the benefits of their body heat. Vikings developed sophisticated bedding systems using straw, rushes, and other absorbent materials that could be regularly replaced and composted for future agricultural use. The feeding of confined animals required careful calculation of available fodder supplies against the animals' nutritional needs and their value to the community. Hay and grain that had been carefully stored during the harvest season had to be rationed to ensure that valuable animals survived the winter while not consuming resources needed for human survival. The balance was delicate. Underfeed the animals and they would stop producing milk or die from malnutrition. Overfeed them and the community might face starvation before spring. Animal health monitoring became a daily responsibility that required recognizing the early signs of illness, injury, or nutritional deficiency. A sick cow wasn't just a medical problem. It was a heating system failure that could threaten human survival. Vikings developed veterinary knowledge that allowed them to treat common animal ailments using herbal remedies and traditional techniques that kept their living heating systems functioning throughout the harsh winter months. The milking schedules for dairy animals had to be maintained regardless of weather conditions or other challenges. Fresh milk provided essential nutrition that couldn't be obtained from preserved foods, making dairy animals crucial for community health. The milking process in cramped, poorly lit conditions required skill and patience, particularly when animals were stressed by confinement and unusual living arrangements. The processing of fresh milk into preserved dairy products continued throughout winter, providing both nutrition and food storage solutions. Vikings mastered techniques for making various cheeses, fermented milk products, and other dairy items that could be stored without spoiling while providing essential nutrients that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases. The social dynamics of sharing living space with livestock required cultural adaptations that modern people would find difficult to comprehend. Children grew up sleeping next to cows and sheep, learning to navigate around large animals in cramped spaces while avoiding kicks, bites, or other injuries. Adults developed heightened awareness of animal behavior that allowed them to predict and prevent problems before they occurred. The integration of animal waste management into the overall sanitation systems of the Longhouse required innovative approaches that dealt with the constant production of manure while maintaining acceptable living conditions for humans. Vikings learned to use animal waste as fuel for fires when properly dried, as building material when mixed with clay and straw, and as fertilizer that would enrich their fields when spring planting season arrived. The breeding management of confined animals had to balance the desire to maintain genetic diversity against the practical constraints of limited space and resources. Decisions about which animals to breed, when to allow breeding, and how to manage pregnant animals in confined spaces required sophisticated understanding of animal reproduction and careful planning for future needs. The slaughter decisions that determined which animals would be killed for food and which would be kept alive through winter represented some of the most difficult choices communities had to make. These decisions involved complex calculations about the animal's current value as a heat source, milk producer, or breeding stock against their potential value as meat, and the resources required to keep them alive until spring. The emotional bonds that developed between humans and the animals sharing their living space created psychological complexities that had to be managed carefully. Children who had spent months sleeping beside a particular cow or sheep might struggle emotionally when that animal was eventually slaughtered for food. Vikings developed cultural mechanisms for helping people cope with these difficult realities of survival. The training of young animals born during winter months required adapting normal animal husbandry techniques to the constraints of indoor living. Calves, lambs, and other young animals had to be trained to coexist peacefully with humans in cramped conditions, while also learning the behaviors they would need when eventually moved outdoors. The coordination of animal care responsibilities among community members ensured that the demanding work of livestock management was shared fairly while also maintaining consistent care standards that kept animals healthy and productive. These responsibilities included feeding schedules, health monitoring, waste management, and countless other tasks that kept the living heating systems functioning properly. The innovation of animal management techniques continued throughout each winter, as communities faced new challenges and developed creative solutions. New feeding methods, improved bedding systems, and enhanced healthcare approaches were constantly being tested and refined by experienced animal keepers, who understood that even small improvements could have significant impacts on both animal welfare and community survival. The spiritual significance of animals in Viking culture influenced how communities approached livestock management during winter months. Animals weren't just viewed as resources, but as partners in survival whose well-being was connected to the spiritual health of the entire community. Rituals and ceremonies honoring the animals that shared their homes reflected these beliefs while also serving practical purposes. The economic calculations involved in winter animal management required balancing short-term survival needs against long-term agricultural and breeding goals. Communities had to maintain breeding stock for future years while also meeting immediate needs for food, heat, and other resources that animals provided during the harsh winter months. Food preservation and storage during winter months represented one of the most critical survival technologies that Vikings developed through centuries of trial and error. These weren't simple techniques for keeping food from spoiling. They were sophisticated systems for maintaining nutrition, managing scarce resources, and ensuring that communities could survive months without access to fresh food sources. The timing of food preservation activities began months before winter arrived, with communities organizing massive coordinated efforts to process and store the foods that would sustain them through the dark season. The harvest wasn't just about gathering crops. It was about immediately beginning the complex processes that would transform fresh foods into preserved items that could last until the next growing season. Smoking techniques required understanding different wood types, temperature control, and timing that could only be mastered through years of experience. The smokehouses that Vikings constructed weren't simple sheds, but carefully engineered structures that controlled airflow, temperature, and humidity to achieve optimal preservation results. Different foods required different smoking approaches, with fish needing different treatment than meat, and various cuts of meat requiring individualized processing. The salt curing process, when salt was available, involved much more than simply covering meat with salt crystals. Vikings understood the importance of salt purity, the proper ratios of salt to meat, and the environmental conditions that produced the best curing results. They developed techniques for managing the curing process that ensured even preservation while preventing the formation of harmful bacteria that could make preserved foods dangerous to consume. Fermentation represented perhaps the most sophisticated of all Viking food preservation techniques, requiring understanding of bacterial processes that wouldn't be scientifically explained for many centuries. They learned to control fermentation environments to produce safe, nutritious foods that actually improved in nutritional value during the preservation process. Fermented fish, vegetables, and dairy products provided essential nutrients that prevented diseases, while also offering flavors that made monotonous winter diets more palatable. The storage systems for preserved foods had to protect valuable food supplies from moisture, pests, and contamination, while also allowing easy access for daily meal preparation. Vikings constructed elaborate storage facilities using wooden containers, clay vessels, and underground storage pits that maintained optimal conditions for different types of preserved foods. Root vegetable storage required understanding the specific needs of different plants and the environmental conditions that would keep them fresh throughout winter. Turnips, onions, carrots, and other root vegetables each required different storage approaches, with some needing complete darkness, while others required specific humidity levels or temperature ranges. Grain storage presented unique challenges since these essential foods were vulnerable to moisture damage, insect infestation, and rodent contamination. Vikings developed storage techniques using sealed containers, natural pest deterrents, and monitoring systems that protected their grain supplies while allowing access for daily bread making and other cooking needs. The rotation of stored foods ensured that older supplies were used before they spoiled, while fresher items were saved for later in the winter when food quality became more critical. This rotation required careful inventory management and planning that balanced current nutritional needs against future requirements. Quality control of preserved foods required constant monitoring to identify spoilage before it could contaminate other food supplies or cause illness among community members. Vikings learned to recognize the signs of food spoilage and developed testing techniques that allowed them to assess food safety using only their senses and traditional knowledge. The preparation of preserved foods for consumption often required additional processing that restored palatability and nutritional value. Dried foods needed rehydration, salted items required soaking to remove excess salt, and fermented foods often needed cooking or seasoning to make them appealing as part of daily meals. The allocation of preserved food supplies among community members required sophisticated rationing systems that balanced individual nutritional needs against available supplies and community survival goals. These allocation decisions had to account for age, health status, work responsibilities, and countless other factors that determined how much food each person needed to remain healthy and productive. The trading of preserved foods with neighboring communities created networks of mutual support that helped ensure survival during particularly harsh winters when individual communities' food supplies proved inadequate. These trading relationships required careful negotiation and mutual trust, since food security was literally a matter of life and death. The innovation of food preservation techniques continued throughout each winter, as communities experimented with new methods and refined existing approaches based on their results. Successful innovations were shared with other community members and passed down through generations of food preservation specialists, who understood that even small improvements could significantly impact community survival. The cultural significance of food preservation extended beyond mere survival to encompass rituals, celebrations, and social bonding activities that helped maintain community cohesion during the challenging winter months. The sharing of preserved foods during festivals and gatherings reinforced social bonds while also demonstrating successful resource management. The teaching of food preservation skills to young people ensured that essential knowledge was passed down through generations while also providing meaningful work that contributed to community survival. Children learned not just the technical skills needed for food preservation, but also the cultural values about planning, conservation, and community cooperation that made survival possible. The spiritual aspects of food preservation reflected Viking beliefs about the relationship between humans, nature, and the gods who governed agricultural success and community survival. Rituals surrounding food preservation activities acknowledge the sacred nature of the processes that sustained human life, while also seeking divine protection for stored food supplies. The seasonal cycles that governed food preservation activities created rhythms of community life that structured time and provided frameworks for planning and coordination. The timing of preservation activities had to be precisely coordinated with weather patterns, harvest schedules, and the availability of materials needed for processing and storage. The social organization required for large-scale food preservation brought communities together in collaborative efforts that reinforced bonds while also accomplishing essential survival tasks. These community work sessions provided opportunities for sharing knowledge, coordinating resources, and maintaining the social relationships that held communities together during isolated winter months. Textile production during winter months represented far more than simply creating clothing and household items. It was an industrial enterprise that required sophisticated technical knowledge, enormous amounts of time and labor, and coordination of resources that involved entire communities working together toward common survival goals. The preparation of raw materials for textile production began with the care and management of sheep, whose wool would provide the foundation for most Viking textile work. The quality of wool depended on the health and nutrition of the animals, the timing of shearing, and the processing techniques used to clean and prepare the raw fleece for spinning. The sorting and grading of wool required expert knowledge about fiber quality, length, strength, and suitability for different types of textile products. Master textile workers could evaluate wool by touch, determining which portions would be suitable for fine clothing, which would work better for heavy outdoor garments, and which should be reserved for utilitarian items like rope or sacking. The cleaning and preparation of wool involved multiple steps that removed dirt, oils, and other contaminants while preserving the fiber's natural properties that made it suitable for spinning. This process required careful temperature control, the use of natural cleaning agents, and techniques that prevented damage to the delicate fibers. The spinning process itself required years of training to master, with skilled spinners able to create thread of consistent thickness and strength that would perform well in weaving and finished textile products. The quality of spun thread determined the characteristics of finished fabrics, making spinning one of the most critical skills in the entire textile production process. The dyeing of spun thread and finished fabrics used plant and mineral materials that had been gathered and processed during the warmer months when these materials were available. The dyeing process required precise timing, temperature control, and understanding of chemical interactions that produced consistent, long-lasting colors. The weaving process brought together multiple threads to create fabrics with specific characteristics designed for particular uses. Different weave patterns produced fabrics with varying properties regarding warmth, water resistance, durability, and appearance, requiring weavers to understand the relationship between technique and final product characteristics. The design and construction of garments required understanding human anatomy, movement patterns, and the specific performance requirements of different types of clothing. Viking tailors created clothing that had to function effectively in extreme weather conditions, while also allowing the freedom of movement needed for work and daily activities. The maintenance and repair of existing textiles provided essential work that extended the useful life of valuable clothing and household items. Patching, darning, and other repair techniques required skill and creativity to maintain functionality while using minimal materials for repairs. The creation of specialized textile items like sails, ropes, and nets required different techniques and materials than normal clothing production. These items had to meet specific performance requirements that often involved life and death situations, making their quality and reliability absolutely critical. The organization of textile work within the Longhouse required coordination of multiple people working on different aspects of production, while sharing limited space, tools, and materials. The scheduling of textile work had to accommodate other essential activities, while ensuring steady progress on the clothing and household items needed for survival. The teaching of textile skills to young people provided essential education that prepared them for adult responsibilities, while also contributing to community production capacity. Children learned not just the technical skills needed for textile work, but also the cultural values about quality, efficiency, and cooperation that governed community life. The social aspects of textile production created opportunities for community bonding while also accomplishing essential work. The rhythmic activities of spinning and weaving provided natural accompaniment for conversation, storytelling, and the sharing of knowledge that maintained cultural continuity. The innovation of textile techniques continued throughout winter months as skilled workers experimented with new approaches and refined existing methods based on their experience. Successful innovations were shared with other community members and incorporated into the collective knowledge that improved overall textile production. The trade value of high-quality textiles made textile production an important economic activity that could provide communities with resources for obtaining other essential items through trade with neighboring groups. Fine textiles were valuable trade goods that could be exchanged for metal tools, exotic foods, or other items that couldn't be produced locally. The ceremonial and decorative aspects of textile production reflected cultural values and artistic sensibilities that went beyond mere utility. Even practical clothing often incorporated decorative elements that expressed individual creativity and cultural identity while also serving functional purposes. The storage and preservation of finished textiles required understanding how to protect valuable clothing and household items from moisture, pests, and other forms of damage that could destroy months of work. Proper storage techniques ensured that textile items remained functional throughout their useful lives. The allocation of textile products among community members required balancing individual needs against available production capacity and community survival priorities. These allocation decisions had to consider the specific requirements of different people while ensuring that essential clothing needs were met for the entire community. Community leadership during winter months required skills that went far beyond simple authority or decision-making. Leaders had to manage complex social dynamics, coordinate essential survival activities, and maintain morale while making life and death decisions that affected entire communities confined together in challenging conditions. The selection of leaders often reflected not just formal hierarchies, but practical considerations about who possessed the knowledge, experience, and temperament needed to guide communities through winter survival challenges. Leadership roles might shift based on specific needs and circumstances, with different people taking charge of various aspects of community management. The communication skills required for effective winter leadership involved understanding how to convey information, coordinate activities, and resolve conflicts in crowded conditions where every conversation could be overheard by dozens of people. Leaders had to master techniques for private consultation, public announcement, and subtle influence that maintained their authority while preserving community harmony. The decision-making processes used by winter leaders had to balance individual needs against community welfare while also considering long-term consequences of immediate choices. These decisions often involved complex trade-offs between competing priorities that required wisdom, experience, and understanding of human nature under stress. The conflict resolution skills possessed by effective leaders were perhaps more important than any other leadership quality during winter months, when minor disagreements could escalate into community-destroying violence. Leaders had to recognize potential conflicts early and intervene with techniques that restored harmony, without undermining their authority or community cohesion. The resource allocation decisions made by leaders determined how scarce supplies were distributed among community members, while maintaining fairness and preventing the social tensions that could arise from perceived unfairness. These allocation decisions required understanding individual needs, community priorities, and the complex relationships between different community members. The motivation and morale management techniques used by skilled leaders helped maintain community spirit during the darkest and most challenging periods of winter. Leaders had to recognize signs of depression, despair, and social breakdown while implementing interventions that restored hope and purpose to community life. The coordination of work activities required leaders to understand the capabilities and limitations of different community members while organizing essential survival tasks in ways that maximized efficiency and maintained social harmony. Work assignments had to balance individual abilities against community needs while ensuring that essential tasks were completed properly. The crisis management skills possessed by effective leaders were tested repeatedly during winter months when emergencies could threaten community survival. Leaders had to respond quickly and effectively to fires, injuries, food shortages, and other crises while maintaining calm and preventing panic that could worsen emergency situations. The negotiation abilities required for winter leadership involved managing relationships not just within communities, but also with neighboring groups who might provide assistance or present threats during vulnerable winter months. These negotiations required understanding human psychology, cultural differences, and strategic thinking that protected community interests. The teaching and mentoring responsibilities of leaders included preparing younger community members for future leadership roles, while also sharing the knowledge and experience needed for effective community management. Leadership development ensured continuity and succession planning that protected communities from losing essential management capabilities. The spiritual leadership roles often overlapped with practical community management, with leaders responsible for maintaining religious observances, conducting ceremonies, and providing spiritual guidance that helped people cope with the psychological challenges of winter survival. The innovation and adaptation skills demonstrated by effective leaders allowed communities to respond to new challenges and changing circumstances with creative solutions that improved survival chances. Leaders had to balance respect for traditional approaches with willingness to experiment with new techniques when circumstances required adaptation. The accountability systems that governed winter leadership ensured that leaders remained responsive to community needs, while also maintaining the authority necessary for effective decision-making. These systems balanced democratic input with the need for decisive action during crisis situations. The legacy preservation responsibilities of leaders included ensuring that knowledge, traditions, and cultural values were maintained and passed down through generations, despite the challenges of winter survival. Leaders served as guardians of community identity and continuity that extended beyond immediate survival concerns. The personal sacrifice expected from winter leaders often required them to accept reduced comfort, increased risk, and greater responsibility while receiving little additional reward beyond the satisfaction of successful community leadership. Effective leaders understood that their role required putting community welfare above personal interests in ways that demonstrated true commitment to collective survival. As winter deepened and the challenges multiplied, Viking communities discovered that survival wasn't just about having enough food, fuel, and warm clothing. It was about maintaining the invisible bonds that held human societies together when everything seemed designed to tear them apart. The techniques they developed weren't just practical solutions to physical problems, but sophisticated social technologies that preserved human dignity and cultural continuity under conditions that would have destroyed less resilient peoples. The true genius of Viking winter survival lay not in any single technique or innovation, but in their understanding that human beings could endure almost anything as long as they maintained hope, purpose, and connection to something larger than their immediate circumstances. In the depths of winter darkness, surrounded by howling winds and deadly cold, they created light, warmth, and meaning that sustained both their bodies and their spirits through the longest nights of the year. The morning routines that marked the beginning of each winter day required precise coordination and understanding of priorities that could mean the difference between life and death. Waking up in a longhouse wasn't a gradual, leisurely process. It was an immediate assessment of survival conditions that began before your eyes fully opened. The first person awake, usually designated the night before based on a carefully maintained rotation, had the crucial responsibility of evaluating the fire's condition. This wasn't simply checking if flames were still visible. It required understanding the subtle signs that indicated whether the fire had maintained adequate heat throughout the night, whether the fuel supply was sufficient for morning activities, and whether any adjustments were needed to prepare for the day's heating and cooking requirements. The temperature inside the longhouse provided immediate feedback about how well the community's thermal management had performed during the night. A successful night meant waking up cold, but not dangerously so, with breath visible in the air, but extremities still functional. An unsuccessful night might mean finding that water containers had frozen solid, or that people were showing signs of hypothermia that required immediate intervention. The sounds of the longhouse upon waking told experienced Vikings everything they needed to know about the community's condition. The breathing patterns of sleeping people indicated whether everyone had survived the night comfortably. The sounds of livestock revealed whether animals had maintained their health and body heat production. The subtle creaking and settling noises of the building itself provided information about structural integrity and weather conditions outside. The process of rousing the community required careful judgment about timing and priorities. People closest to the fire might wake naturally as the early riser added fuel and stirred the coals, but those sleeping in colder areas might need gentle encouragement to leave their warm bedding and begin daily activities. The balance was delicate between allowing people adequate rest and ensuring that essential morning tasks were completed before daylight disappeared. Personal hygiene routines had to be adapted to winter constraints while maintaining the minimal standards necessary for health and social harmony. The morning wash might consist of nothing more than rubbing snow on face and hands. But even this simple ritual served important psychological functions by marking the transition from sleep to wakefulness and providing a sense of cleanliness that supported mental health. The inspection of clothing and bedding each morning revealed potential problems that needed immediate attention before they became serious threats to survival. Damp clothing had to be dried or replaced, torn garments required mending, and bedding that had become contaminated needed cleaning or replacement. These morning inspections prevented small problems from becoming major crises. The assessment of food supplies each morning required careful calculation of remaining stores against projected needs and consumption rates. Communities had to balance the desire to provide adequate nutrition against the necessity of making supplies last through the entire winter. These calculations became more critical as winter progressed and stored food supplies diminished. The evaluation of fuel supplies demanded similar attention to mathematical precision and long-term planning. The amount of wood consumed during the night provided data about consumption rates under current weather conditions, while the remaining fuel stores had to be evaluated against projected needs for the rest of the winter season. The morning health check of all community members served both medical and social functions. Physical ailments that had developed or worsened during the night required immediate attention, while the general mood and energy level of the community provided information about psychological health and morale that affected everyone's survival chances. The coordination of morning work assignments required understanding individual capabilities, available resources, and the priorities that would govern the day's activities. Essential survival tasks had to be balanced against maintenance activities, craft work, and the social interactions that maintained community cohesion. The weather assessment performed each morning determined what activities were possible and how resources should be allocated throughout the day. Severe storms might require focusing entirely on maintenance of heating and shelter systems, while milder conditions could allow for expanded activities and even limited outdoor work. The morning meal preparation marked the official beginning of the day's activities and provided the first opportunity for community gathering and social interaction. The shared breakfast, however simple, reinforced social bonds while providing essential nutrition needed for the day's work and activities. The planning discussions that often accompanied morning meals allowed community members to coordinate their activities, share information about problems or opportunities, and maintain the communication networks that held the community together. These informal meetings served crucial management functions without requiring formal leadership structures. The spiritual observances that began many winter days connected daily survival activities to larger cultural and religious frameworks that provided meaning and purpose beyond mere existence. Morning prayers, or rituals, reminded people that their survival efforts were part of larger cosmic patterns and divine plans. The preparation of tools and materials for daily work ensured that essential activities could proceed efficiently without interruption due to equipment failures or material shortages. This preparation time also allowed for the maintenance and repair of tools that kept the community's technological capabilities functioning properly. The assignment of special responsibilities for the day addressed both routine needs and unexpected challenges that might arise. Someone might be designated as the primary fire tender, another person might take responsibility for monitoring sick community members, and others might be assigned to specific craft projects or maintenance tasks. The establishment of backup plans for potential emergencies ensured that communities could respond effectively to crises without panic or confusion. Morning discussions often included contingency planning for various scenarios that might develop during the day, from medical emergencies to equipment failures to severe weather events. The communication with neighboring communities, when possible, provided essential information about regional conditions, available resources, and potential threats or opportunities that affected survival planning. These communications were often conducted through predetermined signals or brief visits by designated messengers. The documentation of important information through memory techniques and oral traditions ensured that crucial knowledge about successful survival strategies was preserved and could be shared with other community members or passed down to future generations. The establishment of daily routines and schedules provided psychological comfort and social organization that helped people manage the stress of winter survival while maintaining productivity and community harmony. Regular patterns of activity created structure that made long, dark days feel more manageable and purposeful. Midday activities during winter months required different approaches than the dawn and evening routines that marked the beginning and end of each day. The brief appearance of weak sunlight, when it occurred at all, created opportunities for activities that were impossible during the long hours of darkness that dominated winter days. The precious daylight hours, however limited, were carefully allocated among activities that required visual precision or outdoor access. Repair work that needed good light received priority, as did any tasks that required venture outside the relative warmth and safety of the longhouse. Communities developed sophisticated scheduling systems that maximized the use of available daylight, while ensuring that essential indoor activities continued without interruption. The psychological impact of natural light, even the pale, filtered illumination of a winter sun, provided crucial mental health benefits that Vikings understood intuitively. People were encouraged to position themselves where they could receive whatever light was available, and activities were arranged to ensure that everyone had some exposure to natural illumination during the brief periods when it was available. The assessment of weather conditions during daylight hours provided essential information for planning the remainder of the day and night. Experienced Vikings could read cloud patterns, wind directions, and other environmental signs that predicted coming weather changes, allowing communities to prepare for storms or take advantage of milder conditions. The maintenance of outdoor equipment and structures required taking advantage of any weather breaks that allowed work outside the longhouse. Snow removal from critical areas, inspection of the building's exterior, and maintenance of outdoor storage areas all had to be accomplished during brief periods when conditions permitted. The gathering of additional fuel supplies continued throughout winter whenever weather conditions allowed safe travel to areas where wood could be harvested. These fuel-gathering expeditions were carefully planned operations that balanced the need for additional supplies against the risks of exposure and injury during outdoor activities. The social interactions that occurred during midday hours often differed from the more formal morning planning sessions or evening entertainment activities. Midday conversations tended to focus on immediate practical concerns, while also providing opportunities for informal problem-solving and relationship maintenance. The craft work that continued throughout winter days reached peak productivity during the limited hours when natural light supplemented the illumination provided by the central fire. Textile production, tool-making, and other precision activities were scheduled to take advantage of the best available lighting conditions. The food preparation activities that occurred during midday hours often involved the most complex cooking tasks of the day. The combination of adequate light and sustained heat from the well-established fire created optimal conditions for food processing activities that required careful attention and precise timing. The educational activities that occupied children and young adults during winter months often intensified during midday periods, when lighting conditions supported learning activities that required visual focus. The teaching of craft skills, cultural knowledge, and practical survival techniques all benefited from the improved visibility available during daylight hours. The medical care and health maintenance activities that were ongoing throughout winter often received special attention during midday hours, when lighting conditions allowed for detailed examination of patients and precise treatment procedures. The diagnosis and treatment of injuries and illnesses were significantly easier when natural light was available to supplement firelight. The inventory and resource management tasks that required careful counting and assessment of supplies were typically scheduled during periods when lighting conditions supported accurate evaluation. The management of food stores, fuel supplies, and other essential resources required precision that was difficult to achieve by firelight alone. The communication and coordination with other households or communities often occurred during midday periods when travel conditions were safest and visibility was best. Messengers and visitors typically timed their movements to take advantage of whatever daylight was available for navigation and safety. The maintenance of community morale through special activities, games, or celebrations often received particular attention during midday hours, when natural light created a more cheerful atmosphere that supported social bonding and psychological well-being. The planning and preparation for evening activities began during midday periods when there was adequate light for organizing materials, arranging spaces, and coordinating the various elements needed for successful evening entertainment or social gatherings. As afternoon faded into evening and darkness reclaimed the winter landscape, Viking communities shifted into the rhythms that would carry them through another long night. The transition from day to night wasn't simply a matter of lighting oil lamps or banking the fire. It was a carefully choreographed process that prepared both individuals and the community for the psychological and physical challenges of winter darkness. The evening meal represented more than simple nutrition. It was a social institution that brought the entire community together around the central fire, reinforcing bonds while providing an opportunity to share information, resolve conflicts, and plan for the challenges ahead. The preparation of evening meals required coordination of available ingredients, cooking vessels, and fuel resources, while accommodating the dietary needs and preferences of community members, ranging from infants to elderly adults. The storytelling traditions that flourished during winter evenings served multiple functions that went far beyond simple entertainment. These narratives preserved historical knowledge, transmitted cultural values, provided psychological escape from harsh realities, and created shared experiences that strengthened community identity. Master storytellers understood the subtle arts of pacing, dramatic tension, and audience engagement that could transform a crowded, smoky longhouse into a realm of heroes, monsters, and adventures. The musical performances that accompanied storytelling or stood alone as evening entertainment required instruments that could be crafted from available materials and maintained in the humid, variable conditions of the longhouse. Simple flutes, drums, and stringed instruments provided rhythmic accompaniment to songs that celebrated heroic deeds, mourned lost friends, or simply helped pass the long dark hours with melody and harmony. The games and competitions that occupied evening hours served social functions that were as important as their entertainment value. Physical contests allowed people to maintain fitness and competitive spirit despite the confined conditions, while intellectual games like riddle contests or strategic board games provided mental stimulation that prevented the cognitive deterioration that could result from months of limited mental challenge. The craft work that continued by firelight during evening hours often focused on activities that didn't require precise visual coordination but could be accomplished through touch and experience. The spinning of thread, the braiding of rope, and the maintenance of tools and equipment all provided productive activities that contributed to community welfare while keeping hands busy and minds occupied. The religious observances that marked evening transitions acknowledged both practical and spiritual aspects of surviving another day while preparing for the uncertain prayers, weren't just expressions of gratitude, but requests for protection during times of night. Evening, the vulnerable hours of darkness when fires might die, storms might intensify, and maintenance that occurred during evening hours require conversations and relationship-threatened community survival. The intimated, the various dangers of winter night, might careful navigation of the privacy challenges created by communal living arrangements. Couples, families, and friends had to find ways to maintain personal connections, despite the constant presence of others, who could overhear every word and observe every interaction. The preparation for sleep involved more than simply lying down on straw mattresses. It required coordinating sleeping arrangements that maximized warmth sharing while minimizing conflicts, ensuring that fire-tending responsibilities were properly assigned, and organizing personal belongings in ways that wouldn't interfere with others' rest. The night watch schedules that kept communities safe during dark hours required careful rotation of responsibilities among people with different capabilities and levels of experience. Night watchers had to monitor the fire, listen for signs of problems or threats, and maintain awareness of community welfare while allowing others to rest. The dreams and sleep experiences that occupied the long winter nights took on special significance in Viking culture, where the boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness was understood differently than in modern societies. Dream interpretation provided guidance for practical decisions while also offering insights into spiritual and psychological conditions that affected community welfare. The morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the endless cycle of survival activities that defined winter existence in the harsh northern lands. But for now, in the flickering light of the central fire, surrounded by the warmth of human companionship and the security of shared survival, Viking communities settled into another night of dreams, stories, and the quiet determination that had carried their people through countless winters before. The sophistication of these survival systems, developed over centuries of trial and error, represented one of humanity's greatest achievements in adapting to extreme environmental challenges. Vikings didn't just survive their brutal winters. They created the foundations for a maritime civilization that would eventually span continents and influence the course of world history. Yet the true measure of their success lay not in their eventual conquests or explorations, but in their ability to maintain human dignity, cultural richness, and social cohesion under conditions that would have destroyed less resilient peoples. In the depths of winter darkness, they proved that human beings could not only endure the harshest conditions nature could impose, but could find ways to create beauty, meaning, and hope in the very heart of survival itself. The emergency protocols that governed crisis situations during winter months revealed the true depth of Viking survival planning. When disasters struck, there was no time for debate or hesitation. Communities had to respond with military precision to fires, structural collapses, medical emergencies, or sudden weather catastrophes that could wipe out an entire settlement within hours. Fire emergencies represented the most terrifying crisis any longhouse community could face. When wooden structures packed with dry straw, animal fat, and human bodies caught fire, the results were inevitably catastrophic. Vikings developed elaborate fire response protocols that assigned specific roles to every community member. Children were responsible for evacuating animals through designated exits. Adults grabbed essential survival items in predetermined order of priority. The elderly were assigned to safe positions where they could direct operations without interfering with evacuation efforts. The decision-making hierarchy during emergencies bypassed normal social structures in favor of expertise and capability. The person with the most firefighting experience took command regardless of their usual social status. Someone with medical knowledge became the authority on treating burn victims. The individual with the best knowledge of alternative shelter options made decisions about where the community would relocate. Emergency supply caches hidden throughout and around the longhouse provided backup resources for crisis situations. These carefully concealed stores contained fire-starting materials, basic tools, emergency food supplies, and medical materials that could mean the difference between recovery and total catastrophe. The location and contents of these caches were known only to trusted community leaders who could access them quickly during emergencies. The psychological management of panic during crisis situations required understanding human behavior under extreme stress. Vikings developed techniques for maintaining calm and coordinated responses even when people were terrified and confused. Clear, simple commands replaced complex discussions. Predetermined signals communicated essential information without requiring lengthy explanations that wasted precious time. Medical emergencies during winter presented unique challenges since outside help was impossible and treatment options were severely limited. Communities developed triage protocols that allocated limited medical resources based on survival probability and community value. Difficult decisions about treatment priorities had to be made quickly and without sentiment, focusing on preserving the maximum number of lives rather than saving individuals whose chances were poor. The evacuation procedures for different types of emergencies reflected careful planning that balanced speed against safety and resource preservation. Fire-ized getting evacuations prioritized people and animals out alive, even if it meant losing possessions. Structural collapse emergencies focused on rapid rescue of trapped individuals. Severe weather emergencies emphasized securing shelter and maintaining heat sources while waiting out dangerous conditions. Communication systems during emergencies used predetermined signals that could function even in chaotic conditions with limited visibility and high noise levels. Horn calls, specific drum patterns, and visual signals using fire or smoke conveyed essential information about the nature and severity of different types of crises. Recovery planning began, even while emergencies were still unfolding. Communities had to prepare for the aftermath of disasters that might leave them without adequate shelter, heating, food storage, or other essential survival infrastructure. These recovery plans included identifying alternative shelter locations, emergency food distribution protocols, and methods for rebuilding essential systems quickly. The lessons learned from emergency situations were carefully preserved and transmitted to other communities through networks of shared knowledge that helped improve survival strategies throughout the region. Successful emergency responses were studied and incorporated into standard protocols, while failures were analyzed to prevent similar disasters in other communities. The psychological recovery from traumatic emergency situations required community support systems that helped people process their experiences while also learning from what had occurred. The integration of emergency experiences into community narratives served both therapeutic and educational functions that strengthened overall resilience. The preparation for potential emergencies was an ongoing process that occurred throughout winter months as communities identified vulnerabilities, tested response procedures, and maintained emergency supplies and equipment. Regular drills and discussions ensured that everyone understood their roles and responsibilities during different types of crisis situations. The cooperation between neighboring communities during regional emergencies created mutual support networks that could provide assistance when individual settlements faced disasters beyond their capacity to handle alone. These cooperation agreements included protocols for sharing resources, providing temporary shelter, and coordinating rescue efforts during widespread emergencies. The documentation of emergency procedures through oral traditions ensured that essential knowledge about crisis response was preserved and could be accessed quickly when needed. Experienced community members served as living repositories of emergency response knowledge that could guide communities through disasters. The innovation of emergency response techniques continued throughout each winter as communities faced new types of crises and developed creative solutions for problems that hadn't been encountered before. Successful innovations were quickly shared with neighboring communities and incorporated into the collective knowledge base that improved overall survival chances. Weather prediction during winter months became a matter of life and death that required understanding subtle environmental signs that preceded dangerous storms or temperature changes. Vikings developed sophisticated techniques for reading atmospheric conditions that allowed them to prepare for severe weather before it became life-threatening. The observation of cloud formations provided essential information about approaching weather systems that could bring deadly blizzards, ice storms, or sudden temperature drops. Experienced weather readers could distinguish between cloud types that indicated different types of storms and predict the timing and severity of approaching weather events. Wind patterns offered another source of weather information that helped communities prepare for changing conditions. The direction, strength, and consistency of winds provided clues about the movement of weather systems and the likelihood of severe storms that could threaten community survival. Animal behavior served as an early warning system for approaching weather changes that might not be immediately apparent to human observers. Livestock, wild animals, and even insects showed behavioral changes that preceded storms by hours or even days, giving communities valuable time to prepare for dangerous conditions. Atmospheric pressure changes, while not understood scientifically, were recognized through their effects on human comfort and the behavior of fires, smoke, and other environmental indicators. Vikings learned to recognize the subtle signs that preceded major weather changes and use this information to guide their preparation activities. The timing of weather prediction activities required constant vigilance throughout winter months, when conditions could change rapidly and without warning. Communities maintained regular schedules of weather observation that ensured essential information was available for planning daily activities and longer-term survival strategies. The communication of weather information between community members required clear protocols that ensured everyone received essential updates about changing conditions. Weather watchers had to balance the need to provide accurate information against the risk of creating unnecessary panic during uncertain situations. And so, as the embers of our journey through Viking winter survival begin to dim, we've witnessed something truly extraordinary. Not just the triumph of human ingenuity over impossible odds, but the profound understanding that survival isn't merely about staying alive. It's about preserving what makes us human even when everything seems designed to strip that humanity away. The Vikings didn't just endure their brutal winters. They transformed them into the crucible that forged one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the cold northern winds, their indomitable spirit still whispers through the darkness, reminding us that no winter lasts forever.